Today we're going to take a look at Blackmagic's Pocket Cinema Camera 6K Pro. Now this just came out last month, and I'm very curious what it's like to work with because you never know when a job comes in and a producer wants to use this particular camera probably because he owns it. So I need to learn the ins and outs of this camera, what to expect, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, and mostly what are the gotchas compared to other cameras that we use. So what are some of the significant improvements this camera has over its predecessor, the regular 6K? The biggest one, of course, is going to be the internal NDs. Now, this has 2, 4, and 6 stops of internal NDs, which, of course, is a great thing. And if you've never used a camera with internal NDs, once you start using this, you'll probably wonder, like, why don't all cameras have this? And, of course, if you are used to cameras with internal NDs, you always wonder, why can't these cameras have internal NDs? Now, I did see that some people have been complaining about a color cast with the internal NDs, and also that there may be a back focusing issue with the NDs. So I did this very simple, non-scientific test going from clear to the full ND strength of 6 stops. Now, in these examples, I can see a color shift. It's a little subtle, but it's definitely there, and we could definitely correct this in post. Now, is this a deal breaker? To me, no, of course not. I think the NDs, internal NDs, are completely usable with this camera. Now, let's just check focus, zooming in at 400%, and here we're clear, no NDs, and now we're at with 6 stops of ND, and I'm not really seeing a big change in focus. Now, to check back focus, I should have taken a shot at infinity, to be honest, but on the other hand, I almost never take shots at infinity. Now, when you use NDs, we always have to deal with some type of color cast issue, unless the ND is, perfectly matched to the camera that we're using at the strength that we want. It's just one of those things to me, like it just has always existed. I just say you have to deal with it in post. Is it usable or is it not usable? This camera, the internal NDs are definitely usable. And if we feel there's a color cast, it's just going to have to be color corrected out later. Now, the next big improvement to me, in my opinion, with this camera is going to be the battery. And as we see here, this battery from Blackmagic Design is rated for 3,500 milliamp hours. And the old E6 battery from Blackmagic Design was rated for 2,000 milliamp hours. And in this quick test, the runtime from a single battery translated to 1 hour and 10 minutes before the battery died. And I should note that when the battery does die, there's enough juice in the camera to close out the file. So if you can use this camera, especially with the battery grip, with the right batteries, Blackmagic says over 3 hours of recording time. I think it's absolutely, with confidence, I could say, as long as your batteries are fresh, that you could definitely go over 3 hours without a battery change. And then, of course, if it's possible, if you have enough juice on the internal battery, you can start hot swapping the batteries out, which is great if you're not near AC and you're just running on batteries all day. So this is a huge productivity increase going to these NP-style batteries. That's a great thing. Another big improvement to this camera, of course, is the LCD monitor in back. Now, instead of being a fixed monitor, it tilts. It tilts up and tilts down. And this, of course, is a huge productivity boost when you're using this camera. But in addition to that, this monitor in back is now a daylight viewable monitor rated for 1,500 nits. And this, of course, is another great thing, another huge productivity boost to be able to see this large monitor outdoors, in sunlight. Just a big thing, okay? Now, one downside right now is that with many other people, many other reviewers, and definitely with this particular camera, this monitor goes blue with the slightest bit of underexposure, and it's not even like a subtle blue tint. It's a pretty heavy blue tint. It's a problem. Blackmagic, will address it, or they really need to address it, either through returning the camera to where you bought it, unfortunately, or through a firmware fix. So one way or another, this issue will have to be taken care of because evidently not every camera is blue, but it seems that a lot of cameras are blue. So that's just something that's on Blackmagic, okay? But otherwise, it's a great improvement. With the 6K Pro, we do have a small improvement and update with audio, and that, of course, are the 2 mini XLR plugs on the side of the camera. Now, this is great because, if you're going to record audio directly in the camera, you can now have 2 separate inputs, 2 separate channels, and the microphone port on top I believe that still takes time code. So if you have a Tentacle Sync or a similar product, you can plug your time code here. The camera automatically interprets the signal as time code and not as audio. And then you have your 2 audio channels here. Now, of course, in the menu system, you can there's a lot of flexibility in terms of routing the audio, where it's going left or right, if it's getting from the camera, if there's no audio coming from the mini jack, the 3.5 millimeter mini jack, or coming from the XLRs, with or without phantom power. So it's kind of like a full-fledged audio system now, which is always a good thing. So, but to hear the quality of the audio, that's always my question. And this is a quick test that I do to test the audio quality. All right, so we are now set up for a quick audio test. We have our hypercardioid over here recording. It's feeding directly into the sound device's mixer. Now I'm taking a line out, a reading out from the mixer, going to the back of the camera. And what we'll do is we'll ping back and forth to hear the difference in the audio levels with the recording. Now for the recording, once again, I'm just going to read from Patrick Rothfuss's book, just for a little consistency, okay? So here we go. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. The most obvious part is a hollow, echoing quiet, made by things that were lacking. The most obvious part is a hollow, echoing quiet, made by things that were lacking. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees, set the inn sign creaking on its hooks, and brushed the silence down the road like trailing autumn leaves. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees, set the inn sign creaking on its hooks, and brushed the silence down the road like trailing autumn leaves. Listening to both these clips on an edit system with, studio headphones, I have to say that they sounded, pretty identical to me. Now, I'm not an audio professional, but, to my ears, they sounded really close. Now let's listen to the camera recording audio directly. Now for this test, I'm taking a signal from the microphone directly into the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro, and we will compare side by side what that sounds like. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet, made by things that were lacking. The most obvious part is a hollow, echoing quiet, made by things that were lacking. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees, set the inn sign creaking on its hooks, and brushed the silence down the road like trailing autumn leaves. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees, set the inn sign creaking on its hooks, and brushed the silence down the road like trailing autumn leaves. Now in this setup, I can definitely hear the difference, in the edit system. When we plug the microphone directly into the camera, it's not as crisp and not as lively as recording to the sound devices. Sound is just slightly deader. Now, it's not bad. And again, by the time this file gets compressed, it gets over to YouTube, it gets compressed again. Will you be able to hear the difference, especially if you're not listening on headphones? I'm not sure, but I can tell you on the edit system, to me, it's a fairly clear and distinct difference. However, it just seems these past couple of years, the audio recording capabilities of a lot of these cameras has gotten a lot better than what it used to be, at least from what I remember. Now this is a quick look at rolling shutter, and again this is a very anecdotal test as I pan back and forth looking at the window frames, and as you can see the rolling shutter is pretty typical of a camera. Now one area that I definitely need to become more familiar with the Pocket 6K Pro is the different field of view options or limitations of this camera. As I cycle through the different resolutions, aspect ratios, and sensor areas, you can see the variety of different field of views that we get with this camera. And again, it's just a matter of getting familiar with the options, and mostly I think it's laying it down to working with certain sensor areas to get a better field or a better feel for the field of view to expect, at any particular resolution. And of course, if we need 120 frames per second, we will need to go to the 2.8K sensor area. With the 6K Pro, we have at least 4 options to record media. And internally, We of course have the CFast 2.0 card, or an SD card, especially if we use a faster V90 SD card. On this side, through the USB-C port, we can use a hard drive, an external drive like the Samsung units to record with this camera. And then, of course, through the HDMI port, that can go to the control room for recording, or to an external recorder like one of these Atomos units. So those are, at least 4 different options for recording media. Now, the Pocket 6K Pro is, of course, a dual native ISO camera. And with this next test, I'm just going to it's a quick low light test to see, what can I get away with, basically. Now, I'll start with the base ISO, and I'll go up with ISO until the blacks really fall apart. And my question is, how high can I go before I have to jump up to 3200 ISO? And on the high end, once you're up there, how high can I take it before I get really uncomfortable with the image quality? Now, the truth of the matter is, when you're shooting, if you're in a situation where you just don't have enough light, you're probably just going to shoot it anyway. At least I would, because at least you have something in the can. Now, you may or may not have it, and you may have to come back, because that's just the reality of production work. But at least if you have something, you have the option, or you can make the decision to go back and get what you need, or if it's going to be good enough. And, unfortunately, sometimes, the producers decide it's good enough for cost reasons, but, at least you have the shot in the can. So here's the low light test, a very quick low light test, basically to see what I can get away with. Now, here's our scene, and we're going to zoom in 200% to get a good look at the duvetine. And of course, I exposed for the gray card, the 18% gray. And at 400, our card, as you can see, is pretty clean along the borders and the gray and the black areas. And as we hop to 800, a little bit of noise starts coming in. 1600, of course, gets a little bit worse. 3200, I thought it would actually look a little cleaner once we jumped to 32, but it did not in this example. Now, 6400, of course, pretty noisy, even though we are at 200%. And of course, it keeps on getting noisier and noisier till we get to 25,600. Now, one thing that's very interesting is the color. Now look, as we go back and forth between 400 and 25,600, and what's kind of astounding to me is that the color chips are not shifting a lot. I mean the noise. I'm looking at a vector scope, and the noise, of course, kind of blurs out the vector scope, but the targets are not moving, and this is very unexpected and very good. Two of the best features with this camera that I think are the user interface and also the codecs. This camera gives us ProRes or DNxHD or DNxHR, and of course, Blackmagic RAW. RAW is a whole separate issue, but to have it internal and of course integrated so tightly with Resolve is just a tremendous advantage of this camera. But the main thing I'm going to talk about is the codec, ProRes RAW, because the number one request I get for codecs is to get the files in ProRes. That's what people want, flavor of ProRes. Now, Blackmagic, Arri, almost from the beginning, they've always had ProRes options. Why Sony, Canon, Panasonic, and the other manufacturers, why can't they just give us ProRes when Blackmagic, all their inexpensive cameras have given us ProRes from the beginning? I don't know. And because they request ProRes, that's why I have these things like a Shogun 7, Ninja 5. I have these monitors because, of course, I could record ProRes, and that's what clients want. So Blackmagic gets that right completely. As far as the ergonomics, besides the eyepiece issue, the fact that this is so simple, I really like, because it's more like a film camera. We have, ISO, shutter, white balance, 3 little buttons on top. We have 3 programmable buttons, custom buttons right down here. And of course, as you know from the other reviews, the instant high frame rate button, just a switch, you go to high frame rate mode. This to me is a great thing. Menu, punch in, and the fact that, we could just, double tap and get a close up, and then do, the finger swipe to go even tighter for a quick punch in, tap to get back out. Just interface wise, they really got it right with this camera, with this series of camera. I wish other manufacturers were so easy. Now, of course, not everything is perfect with the 6K Pro. And for myself, the two major drawbacks to this camera are, number one, lack of waveform monitors. Even at $2,500, I think that Blackmagic, because they have so many other products, they could have incorporated waveforms into this camera. And just because personally, I really dislike using the histogram and also false color. I'm so used to cameras, professional cameras, just having waveform, and that's what I rely on. Waveform, vector scope. I wish Blackmagic would just add it to this camera. And the other huge deficit professionally is going to be the lack of an SDI port. That wraps it up with Blackmagic's Pocket 6K Pro. And I have to say, once again, Blackmagic is being very disruptive to the industry by offering this feature pack camera for the price of, $2,500. Now we're talking about a Super 35 sensor size camera, 6K, that has internal NDs. It has all the right codecs, ProRes, DNx, Avid's, DNxHR, and also Blackmagic RAW. All of that can be recorded internally to CFast or to fast SD cards, or you could go out, from HDMI or the USB port going to an SSD. In addition, we have a daylight viewable monitor. We have a time code input. We have, two mini XLRs for recording audio directly on camera. And we have, batteries. We can, package this and keep it running without rigging it out completely for over 3 hours by switching over to the NP style batteries. Of course, we don't have, class leading autofocus like the Sonys and Canons have right now. But, quite often we still use manual focus lenses, or at least I do. So I am finding that, this camera has become an incredibly competent and versatile, video camera, a full-fledged video camera. It's not a hybrid, it's not a mixed, it's a video camera. Now, of course, it's not perfect. And of course, Blackmagic has some quality control issues to work out with, especially with these monitors. They really shouldn't be releasing it with this type of problem, but it is what it is, and I'm sure eventually it'll be it'll be replaced or it'll be taken care of. But the other thing about Blackmagic, why they're even more disruptive, is when they enabled bidirectional communication with the HDMI port, where you can now remotely control this camera. And if you have the right lens, you can control focus, iris, zoom, and of course, you can control all the functions of the camera internally with their ATEM, software, or with their dedicated camera control unit. They've turned these cameras into like full-fledged TV studio cameras for live production, live mixed productions, for streaming, even for broadcast. So, for $2,500, Blackmagic has made a camera that is, again, incredibly competent. Maybe not a class leader in specific areas, but overall, incredibly competent camera that is perhaps one of the most versatile cameras that's available in the market today, at least with Super 35 size sensors. And that's, that's a great thing. Well, I'm going to end right there, and I'll say thanks again for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.